What if you spent just one night in a place where hundreds of psychiatric patients were once housed? A place where people, after dark, something watches you from the shadows of its endless hallways. In 2022, on the outskirts of a small town in the United States, stood an abandoned mental hospital that had been deserted for years. Called it the Forgotten Asylum. No one dared to enter. Rumors and chilling stories surrounding the building had made it one of the most feared places in the area. But 24-year-old Eric, an adventure video creator, believed those stories were nothing more than superstition. To him, another abandoned building with an exaggerated reputation. One night, armed with only his camera and a flashlight, Eric decided to spend the entire night inside the hospital alone. What he didn't know was that once the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, his life would never be the same. At around 7 p.m., Eric pulled up in front of the old hospital. The shattered windows, rusted gates, and the massive building looming in the darkness looked like something straight out of a nightmare. Turning on his camera, he laughed and said, "Tonight, I'm going to prove that ghosts and supernatural stories are nothing but myths." The main entrance was already half open. As soon as he stepped inside, a cold gust of air slammed into his face. An eerie silence filled the entire building, making every footstep echo through the empty halls. From somewhere deep in the corridor ahead, he heard the sound of metal crashing to the floor. Eric froze for a moment. But after convincing himself it was probably just debris falling or an animal moving around, he took a deep breath and slowly began walking toward the source of the noise. Slowly made his way down the long hallway where the noise had come from. The beam of his flashlight swept across cracked walls, peeling paint, and pieces of broken furniture scattered across the floor. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, there was nothing there. "Probably just a rat," he said to the camera with a nervous smile. But as he turned to leave, something on the floor caught his attention. In the thick layer of dust were a series of fresh footprints. Eric's heart immediately began to race. This place had been abandoned and sealed off for years. So who could have left those tracks? He knelt down and shined his flashlight closer. The footprints were clear and recent, as if someone had walked through the hallway only for a few moments. Eric stood silently, staring at the footprints. A chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm and continue exploring. Then, from the second floor above him, he heard something. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of slow footsteps echoed through the building. It was so clear that it sounded as if someone was walking across a wooden floor with heavy, deliberate steps. Eric quickly pointed his flashlight toward the staircase, but all he could see was darkness. "Hello? Is someone up there?" he shouted. No answer. The footsteps continued for a few seconds, then suddenly stopped. Silence swallowed the hospital once again. The eerie quiet felt even worse than the noise itself. Eric stood completely still, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing on the second floor, hidden in the darkness, watching him. Every ounce of courage he had, Eric slowly climbed the staircase and stepped onto the second floor. The air up there felt even colder than it had downstairs. A long corridor stretched out before him, lined with old patient rooms on both sides. Most of the doors were broken, hanging loosely from their hinges, while others stood partially open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Keeping his camera rolling, Eric cautiously moved forward. Then something caught his eye. He glanced at the camera screen and froze. At the very end of the hallway, a dark figure had appeared for just a split second. Eric immediately swung his flashlight toward the spot. Nothing. The corridor was completely empty.
His pulse began to race. Quickly, he stopped and replayed the recording. There it was. The shadowy figure was clearly visible for a brief moment before disappearing from view. Eric stared at the screen in disbelief. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, and strangely distorted. And the more he looked at it, the more he realized it didn't look human at all.
He replayed the footage over and over again, hoping he had missed something. But every time, the same dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway for a few brief seconds before vanishing without a trace. As he struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, a sudden crash exploded from his right. Bang! Eric jumped back in shock. An old door in the middle of the corridor had just slammed shut on its own. His heart pounded as he stared at it. Hanging from the door was a rusted metal sign that read, "Isolation Ward." Before he could react, a new sound emerged from inside the room. A slow scraping noise. Scratch. 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 It sounded as if something was dragging its fingers across the other side of the door. Eric stood frozen, unable to move. Then, through the silence, he heard a faint whisper. So quiet it was almost impossible to make out. But he was certain. The moment Eric heard the whisper, a wave of terror shot through his entire body. His mind raced. Should he run? Or should he find out what was really happening? After a few moments of hesitation, curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he reached for the old door and pushed it open. The rusty hinges groaned loudly as the door creaked inward. Eric aimed his flashlight into the room. Dust covered every surface. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor, and large patches of paint had peeled away from the walls. At first glance, the room appeared completely empty. No one was there. Then his flashlight beam landed on one of the walls. Eric froze. The wall was covered with dozens of deep scratch marks. He stepped closer. Between the scratches, the same sentence had been carved over and over again, as if someone had written it repeatedly in a state of panic. He stands in the darkness. Again, and again, and again. A cold knot formed in Eric's stomach. But then he noticed something even more disturbing. Beneath all the older markings was a single fresh scratch. The lines looked newer than the rest, as though they had been carved only moments ago. As if someone had been standing in that room just before he arrived. The sight of the fresh scratch marks made Eric's throat go dry. Trying to stay calm, he immediately pointed his camera at the wall and began recording everything. In the corner of the room stood a rusted metal cabinet that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Driven by curiosity, Eric carefully pulled it open. The hinges squealed loudly. Inside were dozens of old patient files covered in a thick layer of dust. As he searched through them, one file instantly caught his attention. Written across the cover in faded red ink were the words, "Richard Hales, extremely dangerous." Eric slowly opened the file. According to the records, Richard had repeatedly claimed that a tall black figure lived in the darkest parts of the hospital. He insisted that it watched people from the shadows. The staff believed he was suffering from severe delusions and documented his claims as symptoms of mental illness. But as Eric continued reading, his expression changed. The final page contained a single note, a note that sent a chill down his spine. Patient missing. Eric swallowed hard and kept reading. There was one more line beneath it. Never found. After reading Richard Hale's file, Eric felt deeply unsettled. He tried to convince himself that everything in the records was simply the imagination of a disturbed patient. To calm his nerves, he decided to review the footage he had recorded so far. At
first, everything looked normal. Just empty hallways, abandoned rooms, and the old isolation ward. Then something caught his attention. A single frame. Eric paused the video. A few minutes earlier, while he had been reading the file, the camera had also been recording the wall behind him. Curious, he zoomed in. The moment the image became clear, the color drained from his face. Standing near the wall was a pale, unnatural face. Its skin looked sickly and almost lifeless. The eyes were fixed directly on the camera, watching, unblinking. Eric stared at the screen in disbelief. He was certain no one had been standing there when he recorded the footage. His hands shook as he replayed the clip again. The face remained visible for several seconds. Then, without moving away or turning around, it slowly faded into the darkness behind it, as if it had never been there.
The face that appeared in the recording had terrified Eric. But along with the fear came something else. A growing obsession to uncover the truth. Trying to make sense of everything, he returned to Richard Hale's file and carefully examined the final pages. That's when he noticed a handwritten note. Following the incident, the third floor was permanently sealed. Eric's pulse quickened. According to the hospital's old floor plan, that entire section had been closed off for years. Grabbing his flashlight, he headed toward the upper staircase. As he climbed, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air became colder, heavier, almost as if the building itself didn't want him going any farther. When he reached the stairs leading to the third floor, he noticed something strange. A thick layer of dust covered every step. But cutting through that dust was a trail of fresh footprints. Eric stopped. The tracks were clear. Whoever had made them appeared to have walked there only minutes earlier. Slowly, he followed the footprints upward, step by step. The trail led him through the darkness until he finally reached a massive iron door at the end of the corridor. The door looked ancient, its surface covered in rust. Then Eric's flashlight revealed something that made his stomach drop. Deep scratch marks covered the metal. Not on the outside, on the inside. As if something had desperately tried to claw
Eric
its way
stood
out.
frozen for a moment, staring at the massive iron door. A thick layer of rust covered its surface, suggesting it hadn't been opened in years. Yet the scratch marks looked different. They seemed newer, almost fresh. Taking a deep breath, Eric grabbed the handle and pushed with all his strength. Creak. The metal groaned loudly as the door slowly swung open, as if it hadn't moved in decades. Beyond it lay a long, dark ward. Rows of old hospital beds stretched into the shadows, their frames covered in dust and decay. The air was thick with the smell of rot and dampness. Eric cautiously stepped inside, sweeping his flashlight across the room. Then, the beam landed on a section of the wall. His heart skipped a beat. Written in large, uneven letters were the words, "Don't let it know that you can see it." Eric stared at the message, trying to understand what it meant. Who had written it? And what exactly was it? Before he could think any further, a sudden sound echoed from the far end of the ward. Footsteps. Fast footsteps. Someone or something was running. The sound rushed through the darkness. Thud, 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 thud. Eric immediately swung his flashlight toward the noise. The footsteps continued for several seconds. But there was no one there. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Just empty darkness. Yet the sound of running had been unmistakably
The sound of running footsteps echoed throughout the ward. Thud, thud, thud. The noise bounced off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. Eric swung his flashlight toward the direction of the sound, but all he could see was darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence settled over the ward. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Eric stood completely still, gripping his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then, he saw it. At the far end of the ward, something was standing in the darkness. A figure. Tall. Far too tall. Its head nearly reached the ceiling. As Eric's flashlight trembled, the shape became clearer. Its arms and legs were impossibly long, stretched far beyond normal human proportions. The creature stood perfectly motionless, not breathing, not moving, just watching. A wave of terror rushed through Eric's body. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. And then he remembered the message written on the wall. Don't let it know that you can see it. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. But it was already too late. Slowly, very slowly, the figure began turning its head toward him, until its gaze locked directly onto
As the figure slowly turned its head toward Eric, the beam of his flashlight trembled violently in his hands. Then he saw its face, and the sight nearly stopped his heart. The creature's face was almost completely flat. Where its eyes should have been, there were only two deep black hollows that seemed to swallow the light around them. Eric stood frozen in terror. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, the creature tilted its long neck at an
Eric was running through the dark hallway as fast as he possibly could. His breathing had become completely uncontrollable, and the camera in his hand shook violently with every step he took. Behind him, the sound continued to echo through the hospital. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps were now so close that they seemed to be right beside him. Fear tightened around his chest. As he reached the staircase, he made the mistake of looking back. The figure was still standing in the middle of the corridor. But now it was much closer. Far closer than it should have been. Eric couldn't remember seeing it run. He hadn't heard it chase him. It was as if the thing moved only when he wasn't looking at it. As if every time his eyes left it, it somehow changed its position. A wave of panic surged through him. Without wasting another second, Eric raced down the stairs and sprinted toward the main entrance. Then, something impossible happened. The lights throughout the entire hospital suddenly flickered on. For a single brief moment, the building was illuminated in a cold, ghostly glow. And in that instant, Eric saw something even more terrifying than the creature that had been following him. Something that made his blood run cold.
For a brief moment, as the lights flickered on, Eric could see the entire hallway clearly. And that's when he realized the tall black figure wasn't alone. They were everywhere, standing inside every room, lurking in every doorway, watching from every corner of the hospital. Dozens of identical figures filled the building. Tall, motionless, silent. Every single one of them was staring directly at him. Eric's heart nearly stopped. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights went out again. Darkness swallowed the hospital. Eric let out a terrified scream and bolted for the exit. He burst through the main doors and ran across the parking lot without looking back even once. Moments later, he jumped into his car and sped away from the asylum as fast as he could. The next morning, investigators recovered the footage from Eric's camera. Most of the recording showed exactly what Eric had described: the empty hallways, the strange messages, the impossible figure. But it was the final frame that disturbed everyone who watched it. Just before the recording ended, the camera briefly captured something standing directly behind Eric. The same tall figure, close enough to touch him. Its hollow face was pointed straight toward the camera. Then the screen went black, and the